Hi, you are watching Procurement and Supply Chain Live, and our next speaker is Katie Tamblin. She is the Chief Product Officer at Achilles. As Chief Product Officer, Katie is responsible for aligning customer value to Achilles' unique capabilities. She leads the product team in developing innovative and exciting products that deliver market-leading supplier assurance, leveraging supply chain insights. Katie has more than 15 years of experience supporting supply chain professionals with data driven insights. And before joining Achilles, she spent more than a decade managing supply chain solutions for IHS Markit, delivering supply chain efficiency through applied economic forecasting. So, welcome, Katie, to today's show.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Great to have you here with us, Katie. I'm going to hand over now for your presentation, and I'll be back at the end to ask some questions.
Fantastic. I appreciate your having me. So I'm going to speak to you all today about building supply chain resilience, naturally a very prescient topic given the kind of world that we're living in. There seems to be risk everywhere, and that is, of course, impacting global supply chains. But of course, a very brief introduction for anyone not familiar with Achilles. Achilles has 30 years of experience working in supply chain risk and performance management through supplier assurance, as Scott so kindly said. We work across 11 different sectors with over 550 buying organizations and over 100,000 suppliers in a premium assured network, assessing the performance of global supply chains. We're a team of over 600 people in 17 locations around the globe. And that team is really dedicated towards helping suppliers onboard and share information about their performance, assess that information, audit those suppliers where required, and help purchasing organizations understand what that means for their supply chain landscape. So naturally, as part of that, we look at risk. We spend a lot of time looking at risk. These days, risk is aligned to a lot of broad themes that fall under the umbrella of sustainability. And we can look at risks through the lens of planet, profit, and people. And we can look at risk and how these interdependencies create additional risk factors that were previously perhaps opaque, not visible, or simply not concerns of supply chain professionals in the past. So, for example, there are some fantastic evolutions of environmental action happening that have impacts on global supply chains. So, as an example, as the demand for electric vehicles rises, and as the demand and investment in renewable energy rises, so does the demand for batteries, particularly very large batteries, not the kind of batteries you have in a phone or in a small handheld device. The demand for large-scale batteries has reached record highs. That, of course, puts pressure on the raw materials that go into battery production and the chemistry of batteries, of course. Naturally, as we have seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of those inputs, like nickel, have skyrocketed in price. And so we estimate, working with commodities and analysis organization, that the cost of an electric vehicle has risen by $1,000 based on the nickel price surge that we've seen recently. And finally, if we look at this through the lens of the impact on people and social impact, we can see that sometimes even in the pursuit of fantastic environmental objectives, that people are not always enhanced, or people may face working conditions that are not the best. So, for example, it was recently reported that due to COVID lockdowns, some factory workers are given sleeping bags and mattresses and being kept in factory bubbles. This is just one example of a number of examples of working conditions that are maybe substandard or less than ideal for the people in those supply chains. So what we do is we look at all those sorts of risks, and we compile the risk factors, into our quarterly resilience index. So Achilles publishes this resilience index and accompanies it with a risk report once a quarter. I'm giving you a slight preview of the report that will be published next month in May, but you can visit Achilles.com if you want to download historic reports. They're open, they're freely available to all. And what we've seen throughout 2021 and into the beginning of 2022 is large drops in supply chain resilience, which of course means very high risk. So our resilience index remains in the high risk range. In early 2022, the first quarter reading is looking like it's going to stay in that range. And we saw it essentially drop dramatically throughout the course of 2021. So we started 2021 in kind of a moderate range for risk, and we have risen into a high risk range throughout the year, and it looks like we're going to stay there. A lot of that has to do with price pressures. So we saw skyrocketing prices last year. We saw them rise another 30% in the first quarter, of course, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Prior to that action, we thought prices might be leveling off or might have slightly less pressure. But of course, we've not seen that unfold given geopolitical events in the first quarter. The other thing we've observed is confidence in supply chains has been falling dramatically. So from quarter 3 to quarter 4 of 2021, we saw our social media sentiment index for supply chain disruption grew more negative by over 100%. So what that means is sentiment on social media regarding supply chain disruption was twice as negative in Q4 of 2021 as it was in Q3. What we've seen throughout the course of the first quarter of 2022 is another significant fall into negative territory. So we've seen it grow even more negative by about 37% in the first quarter of 2022. So all of these factors suggesting high risk for supply chain disruption and very low resilience of supply chain. So how do we look at that? I wanted to provide some context of the resilience index itself and all of the lenses through which we assess risk. We look at economic risk. We know that 28% of disruptions in the supply chain are down to supplier failure. A number of those failures are related to financial instability or bankruptcy amongst the supply base. And of course, that has been exacerbated by COVID and the economic pressure that the last 2 years has put on a number of supplier organizations. We also look at the impact on the environment of global supply chains. So we know government targets are calling for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. They're calling for energy efficiency. They're calling for investment in renewable energy. All of these factors have an impact on global supply chains. So what we look at when we measure environmental performance is how resilient those supply chains are, how they are performing against environmental standards. We also look at labor conditions. So we look at whether or not the global supply base is becoming more socially responsible or less socially responsible. We're looking at modern slavery issues reported. We're looking at International Labor Organization reports of working conditions, and we're looking, of course, at our own supplier performance of the suppliers in our network against the key KPIs in labor conditions. We look at legal frameworks and how well organizations are governing themselves. So we look at governance from a political point of view and an economic point of view, but then we also look at company governance. So what are the management systems and processes that supplying organizations have in place? Are they getting stronger with regards to the governance of their processes and their systems, or are they getting weaker? We also look at safety and security. Health and safety is really, Achilles has been helping to assure the health and safety of supply chains and colleagues in the supply chains for over 30 years. And so ensuring that your suppliers treat their employees in the same way you would treat your own is a critical component of what we do and how we assess suppliers. So we include health and safety metrics and the health and safety scores that our suppliers achieve in our measure of the resilience of supply chains. And then finally, we look at fragility. So we look at things like weather data. We look at shipping reliability. I already mentioned social media, prices. So we look at all the kind of global conditions that are impacting supply chains that might make supply chains more or less fragile. So all of these things factor into to what we do, and they're built on a foundation of the supplier assessments that we carry out as part of our regular work. We really categorize risk into two categories. So we look at resting risk and we look at reactive risk. So resting risk is you can think of it as those unavoidable risks. They are structural, they are just part of doing business, and they can be made better or worse depending on who's in your supply chain. So I'll give you an example. There are inherent risks of doing business. Your suppliers are the source of a number of those risks, and how sustainable or responsible your suppliers are will represent a relatively structural part of your supply chain risk. So, for example, if you have suppliers that are acting unethically, that represents an underlying risk to your supply chain, because no one wants to wake up to a headline that their company is related to a supplier who has been convicted of labor malpractice, or had some sort of child labor conviction, or human trafficking infringement, or any other unethical, practice. So those risks, you can proactively work to manage those risks out of your supply chain, or at least minimize them. And of course, you'll never be 100% risk-free, but you can work over time proactively to minimize resting risk in your supply chain. Reactive risk is much harder because reactive risk comes from things that are typically by nature unpredictable. So typically external events, they can introduce unexpected risks to your global supply chain. So that's going to be stuff like a global pandemic, an invasion. Russia's invasion of Ukraine would be a good example of a risk that is truly reactive in nature. And so our resilience index, we try to capture those risks as soon as they happen through things like social media sentiment, by looking at weather patterns and geopolitical changes. And so the way that you manage or mitigate against that reactive risk, of course, is going to be by its nature different from how you would manage or react to your resting risk. But they are not unrelated. So if you are proactively managing your resting risk, you are better prepared to react to external events. So how do we strengthen resiliency? So we work with a number of procurement and supply chain professionals, and what we're seeing are the kind of key trends of how those organizations and how these thought leaders in that space are managing to grow resiliency under such difficult conditions as we've seen over the last couple of years, is really through three things. So the first is driving visibility. If you don't know where your risks are, it's extremely difficult to mitigate them. And so often the risks come from tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. So what we've seen over the last several years is organizations have gotten very good at assessing the risk in their tier 1 supply base, but it gets very, very fuzzy and very opaque in tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 4. Most organizations don't even know who the actors are at that level. And so then, of course, managing that risk becomes incredibly difficult. And that's quite often where we see these surprises of risk factors, and the unfortunate headline of an organization being picked up on bad practice in their upstream supply chain. So the first step is to drive that visibility, identify who is in your supply chain, not just in your tier 1 supply base, but in the full chain. The second thing that companies are spending a lot of time and energy doing is creating ways of insulating their supply chains. So that could be identifying multiple sources of supply. That could be holding additional inventory, more inventory than they would usually hold, to ensure production lines stay moving. And it could be just working on deeper partnerships with their critical suppliers. But all of those are about providing some insulation to ensure that if there is a supply chain disruption, that your organization is able to continue its production. It will vary. What methods are right for your procurement or supply chain team will vary by the industry that you're in, the part of procurement that you manage, the items that you produce, whether you're product manufacturing company or service company. That will impact what insulation looks like for you. But the core idea remains the same, that you need to build up some buffer to disruption in your supply chain. And then finally, teams are working really hard on driving agility and being able to react or pivot very quickly into alternative products or processes should disruption occur. So let's look at some of the disruptions that have been so key, recently in the recent past. So of course, the semiconductor shortages have wreaked havoc across supply chains. I mean, you would be hard pressed to find something that doesn't have semiconductors in it these days. We've also seen sawn timber shortages in 2021 filtering through into a number of downstream items. And I've already mentioned batteries. So if we look at microchip shortages, this is affecting more than 169 industries. We're seeing major price increases, shortages, queues amongst customers. This is affecting automobiles, graphics cards, video games, computers, handheld devices. We've seen this filter through, and I'll go into an example in a little bit, into supply chains for things where you wouldn't even really think they would be impacted, like street lighting, electronic equipment for medical purposes. So, semiconductors really are a part of our life everywhere. So IT equipment that almost every procurement team has to procure, of course, is going to be impacted by this shortage. And experts are predicting that the shortage is going to be with us for quite some time. So that's something to watch. We're still seeing really long lead times for certain types of IT equipment. We're seeing higher prices, which need to be factored into budgets. And we will expect to continue to see scarce supply. Sawn timber, this impacted construction markets last year. But I think what a lot of people forget is that, a byproduct of that is the production of pulp and paper. So paper products, whether they're for packaging purposes or whether they're for office paper, of course, are being impacted by last year's sawn timber shortage. And scarce supply and higher prices will, of course, be a regular feature throughout. We saw some of that towards the end of last year. It'll be a regular feature throughout this year as well. And finally, batteries. I mentioned the large scale batteries that we see in big renewable projects and we see in electric vehicles. But let's not forget that your everyday battery is also impacted by these factors, whether it's nickel price increases, whether it's lithium shortages in the medium term and capacity constraints, whether it's shipping issues. All of these things are going to impact batteries across the scale. And that's going to drive up, again, higher prices and scarcity of supply, longer lead times. It's estimated that the energy storage shortage will dwarf the microchip shortage in the medium term, particularly for auto production. So, of course, that is going to impact a number of industries as well. So how do I drive visibility? So one of the ways in which we work with our customers is helping them to map out their supply chain. So this is a very pretty picture with a lot of dots. And you're probably thinking, what on earth are all those dots and how does this help me? But, when I first started to see pictures like this, and what this is a picture of our underlying knowledge graph and the way that we store data about supply chains. When I first started to see these pictures emerge as we built this database years ago, it really stood out to me that finally I was seeing something that could capture the complexity of global supply chains. And knowledge graph data technology is really designed for complex relationship management. And so it's perfectly suited for mapping out supply chains. So we've been working on mapping supply chains with our customers for years and years and years. And we're now in a really exciting phase of that, in that we're applying this really innovative data technology to help us do that. So when you look at this pretty picture of lots of dots and all of the connections, it's useful to know that the green dots in this picture are products and services. The blue dots are suppliers, and you'll see lines between certain blue dots and certain green dots, and those lines represent relationships. So a line between a blue dot and a green dot means that supplier supplies that product. The yellow dots are the countries, and the pink dots are the scores of those suppliers. So this is a picture of the average supply chain for a ventilator. So to manufacture ventilators, which of course were in short supply and very important during the height of the COVID pandemic, still very important, I should add. This is your supply chain of a ventilator. These are the actors that are needed. These are the products and the services that are needed to manufacture ventilators. So what this helps us to do is to identify some of the existing and potentially to come pinch points within the manufacturing process. So how do I apply it? So I've filtered this out. So we're just looking at the green dots, the products, and I've looked specifically at semiconductors. And so you'll see a red circle around semiconductors, and you can see some of the relationships. And what this pretty picture is showing you is that semiconductors enter the supply chain for a ventilator in lots of different ways. Ventilators are actually reliant on a number of different types of microprocessors and semiconductors. And they enter into things like they enter into it directly, they enter into sensors, they enter into a number of factors. And so when you see in the news that semiconductor manufacturing is disrupted, when you have a map like this that shows you all the ways in which it could impact your supply chain, you can very quickly see, oh my goodness, I've got microprocessors that impact my manufacturing process. I need to reach out to my suppliers of ventilators. I need to reach out to my suppliers of parts for ventilators that are impacted by semiconductors. And then therefore I can find ways to secure supply, to build up that insulation, not just for the manufacturer of the ventilator itself, if I need to purchase ventilators, but also for all of the tier 2 or tier 3 items that go into the manufacture of ventilators. So it's also important to understand company to company relationships. So we look at product relationships so we can understand what products might disrupt you, but it's also really important to understand who are the actors in your supply chain. So this is a slightly anonymized version of one of the maps that we would build for a customer of ours, where we look at assuring and providing risk management and performance management for tier 1 suppliers as part of our core value offering. But what we can also offer is a look at who are the suppliers to that supplier. And we can start to assess risk up the full chain rather than just at the tier 1 level. So now that I know that I need to build up a buffer stock, I need to insulate my supply chain, and I need to find alternative sources of supply. How do I find alternative sources of supply without introducing additional risk to my supply chain? As in, how do I know that the suppliers that I find that can supply these products are ethical and that they are aligned to the values of my organization, or that I'm not going to end up cutting any corners or introducing additional undue risk by working with a supplier that's not been vetted or validated or that's unknown to me? It's very easy to get tripped up or introduce additional risk to your supply chain when you have to make alternative sources of supply decisions very quickly, because you won't have time to do the vetting when the risk is upon you. So what Achilles can offer is a data set of already assured suppliers. So you can search for suppliers of products and services, and you can see how they score and what are the risks of using those suppliers. You can see their scores across their financial performance, for their health and safety performance, for their environmental performance, their social performance, and governance. So we're looking across, financial, health and safety, and ESG, which is truly the umbrella, the full view of whether or not a supplier is sustainable. And as we look at all of those, we can assess suppliers, and you can assess suppliers. You'll see there one of the opportunities is to leave feedback and see how those suppliers are performing against their peers and for other buyers as well. And finally, we can put it all together. So the way this works is, we can help flag. We won't get all of them, but we can help flag major areas of shortages that might be coming, or disruptions that might be coming or are happening in the supply chain. And then with that map that's available, whether we provide it or whether you're doing it yourself, you can see where those shortages might impact you. And then finally, you can look to proactively assess and assure and identify alternative sources of supply in those critical areas where you might see that disruption is coming. And that gives you that agility, the ability to pivot to a new supply source or a new process as and when that's required. And then we do all of that because at Achilles, our mantra is insight beats hindsight. We want to prepare, we want to proactively address risk rather than find ourselves on the end of a reactive disruption.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Really interesting. I was staring at those. They're almost like Petri dishes with all these little dots in. I was wondering if it was one of those things where if you squint, you can see a certain object. A question though, right? Because you said you made it sound super simple, where you said you can identify where you have a problem with your supplier and find an alternative supplier. But is it as simple as that these days? I mean, things like semiconductors, taking that as the example that you mentioned. It's not so easy just to find an alternative supplier, is it? Because so many of them are impacted.
Absolutely. And that is absolutely true. We cannot, there's no silver bullet. So we can help you find other suppliers that might be able to supply. But in the case of a global disruption like semiconductors, there's no panacea. And many of those suppliers will have similar lead times. So it's just about building up that transparency. You may have to go to 3 or 4 or 5 possible alternatives. And you may find that all 3, 4, or 5 are going to charge you a price just as high, if not higher. And you may find that they all have lead times that are longer than you want. But at a minimum, really it's about preparing for the next risk. So building up those alternative sources of supply so that you have them ready as and when a disruption first occurs, that you can secure the remaining supply very quickly as that disruption unfolds. So yes, but you're absolutely correct. So we are, I wish there was a silver bullet, but there certainly is not.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people attending this show these 2 days looking for silver bullets, but they're in very short supply right now, ironically.
Like everything else.
Yeah. So I'm sure you get asked this question all the time, but what are the most common disruptions you're seeing right now?
The most common ones, so I'll kind of, the ones that we mentioned, certainly semiconductors and batteries are big ones right now. Some of the interesting disruptions that I'm seeing come through are longer lead times for manufactured goods, often large scale manufactured goods like equipment, and that being down to logistical disruptions. So rather than kind of raw material constraints or manufacturing constraints, we're seeing more and more products that are stuck where they were manufactured. And of course, the driver shortage that we're seeing across Europe as a whole, but particularly here in the UK, has impacted a number of items. But also what was really interesting is that the amount of rail that running across Russia that takes goods from Asia to Europe that has now been taken out of capacity has had knock-on effects for air and sea freight from Asia to Europe. So that's meaning higher prices and longer lead times for just getting the goods to you. So that's kind of a different type of disruption and a different type of shortage. It could hit anything. That's what's so frustrating, is it's unpredictable. It could hit any of those goods just because it's more about getting them where they need to be rather than the actual manufacturer.
Yeah. And, along those lines as well, it's impossible to tell, but how long do you expect these disruptions to continue for? Is it almost like a domino effect where you have one or two and then it causes an inevitable disruption that just perpetuates the problems?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely what we're seeing. And it's really interesting. So 2 kind of key comments around that. I will fail miserably to predict, how long it will go on. We were actually, before Russia invaded Ukraine, we were starting to think, and I think the consensus was that maybe we were going to see an improvement in supply chain resilience kind of coming into 2022. And surely 2021 was the worst of it and it couldn't get any worse. And then, something happens that just throws all of that out of the window and puts everything back on into play. So I think there are some areas where we know it's going to go on for a while. So semiconductors, there's simply not enough capacity. That capacity will come online, but it's just a matter of when. Most experts have estimated it'll at least be throughout this year that we will continue to have capacity constraints, and many are saying throughout next year as well. The other one is the batteries. Lithium capacity is in short supply, and it takes 5 years minimum to get new mining capacity online. So while many players are investing in and trying to grow that lithium capacity, it's just going to be a few years before it comes online. So that is probably going to be with us for a while. But that being said, markets are really resilient and people are really innovative. And it's a question of whether or not people will re-engineer batteries to reduce the amount of lithium needed before the lithium comes online, or whether the lithium will come online. But until one of those 2 things happens at scale, then you're going to have higher prices and reduced capacity and constraints around lithium. But I think, the other thing that's really interesting is just the length of this disruption related to the COVID pandemic. So I've worked with, as you said in the kind intro, supply chain professionals for 15 years, and we've seen all kinds of disruption over that time period. But what happens is a disruption and then people get over it. And by the time the supply chain mapping solutions come online, they're over it, But what's happened with COVID is we've had this long protracted disruption, which basically means the technology has evolved to solve these issues because it's been a sustained issue. So I think it's a really exciting time to be addressing these challenges.
Absolutely. And just in 10 seconds, Katie, you mentioned the Resilience Index, which is out in May. Where can people see that if they want to grab it?
Achilles.com. You can see previous publications now, and you can come in May to download that copy, free to all. So please do so.
Okay, there you go. Katie, thanks very much for your session and insights today.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, stay tuned. We'll be right back any second, actually, with the next session.